You talked earlier about leading by example.
Yeah.
So, if you're thinking about touch points in a potential client,
Yeah.
that might be indicative of where the impetus comes from in terms of driving wellness.
Yeah.
From your perspective, is that the domain of human resources or the board or general management? Where would you say that tends to come from or should come from, perhaps?
Right.
Yeah.
What we're seeing is a mixture of a need and also a drive from leadership as well. So the need, what I meant by the need is that they're seeing things on the ground that requires this, especially in the tough 2 years in the past where it's really hard to keep a tab on the engagement level or the wellness on a remote setting, right? And people are reporting like high level of stress and anxiety because of the unknown that we face at that point of time. So therefore, they came to us saying that we really need to support our people. So that is such a great conversation to have because finally we're moving the needle when it comes to mental health conversation and not just about awareness. And now we're taking action about it. But there's also like people leaders that come to us to say like, this is important and we need to do this. And they of course task the HR, which is the typical custodian or champions of this kind of programs. I would think that it needs to come from both the people leaders and also HR themselves. At the end of the day, I think leadership sponsorship is definitely very, very important. It varies because I know that the power dynamics of different organizations is different, right? So there are organizations where unfortunately HR is kind of playing the facilitator role rather than really leading the people conversation. But I think that, either way, there needs to be leadership sponsorship to say that this is important and why is it important. In clients that we've implemented this with, the most successful ones are always the ones that have leadership sponsorship across the board in terms of coming from the different line of businesses especially. So we try different ways to kind of engage them and you kind of bring them on board, and we consistently see that leadership sponsorship is definitely very important. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Cool. So Zenwei, we couldn't talk about corporate wellness without talking about the dreaded COVID phrase. It's rather a cliche, I know, these days, talking about the new norm, but we're still in the realms of, as we go into the endemic phase, we're still in that sort of curve somewhere, that change curve. So I'd be very interested to hear your views on what has been the impact of COVID, or what is this sort of post-COVID culture that you perceive that we're in, and what is the relationship with that and corporate wellness, would you say, at the moment?
Right. It's great that you mentioned that we are still in a change curve because either way, because right now the debate is around like, do we go back to office? Is it hybrid? Is it remote? Right? Either way, there are changes and we are gonna need to adapt, and there are changes that we need to make to our lives.
Yeah.
So for those people who are going back to office, you're literally losing a lot of flexibility.
Of course.
Right? For those people who are on hybrid, there are still some adjustment that you need to do because there's a mixture of things, and perhaps that is more stressful sometimes, right? So either way, I felt like if you are prepared for remote first, you are definitely gonna be ahead of the curve, because if you can serve the remote where everybody is kind of like decentralized and you can't really exactly pinpoint the wellness or the engagement level. If you can deal with that, you definitely can deal with people being on site and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So when people adjust, we think that there's definitely even a greater role for corporate wellness programs or this kind of thoughtful chat, for example, really because that they will need support when it comes to dealing with this kind of change, right? So we say that it's going back to normal, but I think that actually a lot of things are not the same anymore. In terms of like the arrangements of your children and things like that, because you kind of lost that for 2 years. It's not the same, right? So you're able to then have people to get access to resources or support on their fingertips anytime, anywhere. That's going to be useful regardless of the setup that you have, right? And I think that the role of this kind of program is more important than ever. Before the pandemic, we're already seeing that this could be the next wave of crisis when it's mental health crisis. But the good thing that I see out of this conversation is that we have the tools, right? So it's a known thing that works, right? So in terms of, what's the impact to the endemic state of, work from home or hybrid, it's really how do we then provide support, meeting your employees wherever they are, right? They could be back to office, but, because of the demands that comes at them, because everybody is expecting a V curve or whatever curve of recovery that they were all expecting to have, demands are going to be high, right? Let's be honest, in the Asian culture, the work environment here, people are still not comfortable in voicing their wellness concern to their supervisors or to HR even. There was a survey that was done in Singapore. They say that they are extremely uncomfortable in bringing up their wellness matters or HR, mental health related matters to their HR. It's definitely no different here in Malaysia. So if you have a support system that is able for them to go that is safe, that's independent, the bosses won't know what I say kind of situation, is definitely going to be helpful in terms of being able to support them when they are actually struggling or having high level of anxiety or stress.
So confidentiality is crucial.
It's crucial, and it is a constant point that we work with our clients to tell the employees that it is safe, and how do you build that safety, that trust. It's extremely important for this kind of program to succeed.
Absolutely. You've touched on some of the stigma associated with mental health and some of the sort of reservations and cultural factors in Asia around talking about your own mental health. Just be interested to sort of get a sense of where we are here in Malaysia, perhaps, or even across Southeast Asia, in relation to that, to making progress and being more open about wellness and its connection with overall performance, and more of a table discussion. Where would you say we are with that, and what's your projection with that?
I think that there is still lack of a common understanding of how wellness can be approached, because I'm hearing both sides of the story, both from an employee and from an employer perspective. So from the employee perspective, obviously, is the things that we hear, right? There's a lack of empathy around like, how do I cope with all these things that's happening at the same time? But the bosses are just like hounding on, micromanaging all the time. But on the flip side, it's a rather interesting conversation, because there is actually an employer that told me that, we try to implement some of these initiatives to take care of the mental health of people, and sometimes it is quote unquote abused. And the example that this person gave when I heard it is literally the lack of understanding of how this kind of mental health awareness can be used, right? So all in all, I see that there's more work to be done in terms of how do we define wellness and how do we approach it. And for us, I think it's really not just about giving someone support when they reach crisis, but it's more around like, how do we give them resources to be able to sustain themselves and self-regulate themselves so that they can be resilient all the time. And of course, be there for people when their circumstances suddenly change and they're probably in crisis. Perhaps they lost a loved one, and you want to be there for them. But at the same time, how do you serve everyone rather than just the people in crisis? Because it's similar to health crises, where if you can prevent it, obviously you want to, but it's a hard conversation to have because it's not urgent. So we really need to kind of look at it from a perspective of creating that common understanding. And the projection is, I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done around creating solutions that are extremely approachable. So it's kind of like a user experience problem where how do we actually create this in such a way that is easy to understand? And also from an employer perspective, even the bosses can buy into that, right? At the end of the day, they just need to understand. If you don't have a worker, you can't keep them. Of course, you can't be productive.
Do you think there's a generational factor here, which is kind of linked to culture, the sort of Gen Z generation coming through? Do you feel like they're going to be more open talking about how they're feeling and addressing these issues more openly?
Definitely there is, we're seeing some conversations around that, and through, I guess, some anecdotal evidence, it's definitely there is a little bit of a gap that says like, in my generation this doesn't seem to be a thing. But I would argue that it was a thing. It just, they didn't know that what they were dealing with. They just thought that it is part of their work. Because the high level of stress and anxiety they felt, they definitely felt
normalized.
They felt it, they just didn't know what it was, and they just thought it was life. So those are the things that, perhaps the conversation is that, you felt it. It's just that right now we recognize what it is, and we're trying to do something about it so that, not everybody have to go through that, right?
Fantastic.
So going back to around like, what does that play into and how do we kind of change that conversation? I think it's around, I felt like the macro environment where if you can't keep your staff or team motivated or stay with you, they'll slowly realize they need to adapt. I think that is the eventual path that we'll unfortunately need to go through. Of course, we are trying our best to kind of change that narrative around like, when push comes to shove, they will adopt it, obviously. But I think that the conversation is going really well. Fun fact is that someone actually told me recently that, during an interview that they were having with a candidate, they actually asked, does your company provide mental health services or support?
Okay.
So you can see that if you want to attract good talent, it's no longer an optional thing. Maybe it was just one case, but I definitely see the trend growing.
Absolutely.
For sure.
That's good to hear.
I think the analogy that I really liked was that whole seesaw thing, right? And then you have that balancing point. Let's say work requires more, you kind of move that balancing point a little bit more to here. And if life requires more, you kind of move it a little bit.